Bitcoin is the money for the resistance. No matter who's adopting Bitcoin, it's one step closer to sort of global reserve currency and hyper-Bitcoinization. We want to broaden the tent of like Bitcoin adoption because we see the benefits that it might have on society and just for everyday people's lives.
Meet Jason Maier, author of The Progressive's Case for Bitcoin, a book advocating for Bitcoin from a left-leaning perspective, educating progressives on its societal benefits and challenging political assumptions in the space. In this episode, we'll discuss the environmental benefits of Bitcoin the left misses.
Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining specifically could address and mitigate some of those concerns.
How changing political forces will push progressives towards Bitcoin in the coming years.
That people outside of the sort of the conservative bubble are viewing what's happening. They're concerned, right? People on the left fearful of what's the next step and where are we 3 years from now.
Strategies for communicating with the left about Bitcoin and why conservatives and libertarians need them on board too.
Describe to them the problem and echo back to them what their concerns are and how Bitcoin kind of addresses that issue or helps mitigate the problem.
We also find some unexpected common ground.
You're sort of sounding like a libertarian here.
Now, before we dive into the episode, I need to address the tone of the interview and why the elephant in the room is never brought up. We recorded this interview on Wednesday, September 10th at 12:30 p.m. Eastern, about 2 hours before the horrific, tragic assassination of Charlie Kirk. So with that, let's begin.
Jason, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. It is a great change of pace. I listened to your interview with Bitcoin Magazine a couple of years ago, and one of the things that you mentioned is how you will oftentimes be in Bitcoin spaces, and everybody sort of just assumes, well, if you're into Bitcoin and you believe X, you probably also believe A, B, C, D, E, and F. And it's an assumption that I personally have sort of dealt with in the other job that I do. I'm an actor on the side, and I've been in rooms where everybody is sort of on the political left. And if somebody, like you said, cracks a joke or makes a political point, it's just assumed that everybody in the room agrees with them. And hey, I'm here. I don't necessarily agree with what you said.
Right.
So I think it's really important not to fall into groupthink because you can easily start making mistakes and there's nobody to challenge you. So I personally think it's wonderful to have people from a wide variety of perspectives in the Bitcoin space. How do you view the importance of expanding Bitcoin beyond people who are just sort of libertarian or conservatives or ANCAP? And what sort of benefit do you see, if any, to expanding that to the libertarians, conservatives, and ANCAPs to have a perspective other than those that they're exposed to constantly?
Yeah, so I appreciate the question. I think it's probably one of the more important, things to consider, at least sort of my space, my role in the Bitcoin space. My day job is I'm a teacher. I'm an educator. I want people on board with Bitcoin. I get a thrill and energized from teaching high school students math all the time. And now I'm energized by teaching people about Bitcoin and understanding the importance of that technology. And so when you really just view what we're trying to do from sort of an education perspective, it's having different messages out there for different kinds of people, having the ability to sort of question your assumptions or to make people feel comfortable so that they can learn something complicated. All of that's, I think, critical. So I think that that's really the key benefit is if we want to broaden the tent of like Bitcoin adoption, which I think that we do because we see the benefits that it might have on society and just for everyday people's lives. That is harder to accomplish if we're speaking a language that doesn't resonate with people, or if we're assuming that they're on board with certain sort of political or philosophical standpoints that they're not. So just from purely like, how do we teach people about something that they don't know about, or they don't realize the importance of, or is really intimidating? Just having different voices in the space for all of us who consider ourselves Bitcoiners to be able to speak a language, or at least point to somebody to say, well, I know that you don't maybe agree with me on this, but here's a resource that might speak your language, is crucial, because I don't think that we're going to get the next wave of people who really appreciate the value of Bitcoin if we're not able to do that. And for people who are already in it, most of the most frequent message I get about my book is that a Bitcoiner has bought it for somebody that they love or that they care about, right? So it's usually a gift for somebody else. So I think that the message of like a progressive's case for Bitcoin is simply like, here's some of the priorities that exist out there for everyday people who don't really think about Bitcoin a lot. Here are the problems that they see in the world. Here are the frustrations that they have with the system. And how can we talk about Bitcoin in a way that sort of honors those frustrations and those problems that they see in the world? That language and those messages are super important if your hope is to sort of get somebody on board that you care about.
No, I think that makes complete sense. We definitely want to expand Bitcoin, especially people we care about, whatever their politics are, we love them, we care about them, we want them to benefit from this. And I think there's also a bit of a game theory thing that we can get into about how everybody benefits by having more people on board, whether it comes to just simple number go up or not having politicians step in to try to stop it. I do want to get into that, but first, if you don't mind, if you'll bear with me, I would love for you to sort of define how you view progressivism in your mind. And I ask that not to start a political argument, but because for me as a libertarian, it often seems that the definition of progressive, along with the definition of conservative, it's sometimes hard for me to grasp what those principles might be. Sometimes they seem to me to be more of an amalgam of, well, this is our issue position on this issue of the day that we all sort of agree with a wink and a nod, and that can change from month to month or year to year. So and if I'm wrong, please tell me if you think I'm wrong. And maybe you see libertarian ideals that way too. I'm not immune to that. So how would you define like the principles of progressivism or being a progressive, and just so we know we're operating with a common language so we can see how that applies to Bitcoin?
Sure. So I think it's is actually pretty useful because especially for folks that are outside of the U.S., I get this question a lot. So I think that in the most broadest terms, and I speak for myself, I see that the importance of understanding societal structures and understanding that there are people who are sort of systematically disadvantaged or vulnerable in our society, and a desire to see those people, benefited or helped or, sort of recognized in their struggle. So I think that has a lot of very practical, like, all right, this certain policy looks like this because I believe that. But I think that in the broadest sense, that's maybe what we're talking about. But there is a role, like in my worldview and my political landscape of the way I think about things. There's a role for a government to have a voice in some of those solutions and not all. And I think that I'm happy to get into specific, like like you said, like a hodgepodge of different issues on different things. But in general, a recognition that the systems that we have in society, I think Bitcoiners talk a lot about how there's certain systems that are broken, like our financial system is broken, and like it's not Jerome Powell's fault. It's just a system-wide issue that doesn't work. And I see other systems besides the financial system also affecting people in their everyday lives in ways that I think is unfortunate, and things that we can either try to mitigate or replace or help. So I think that that's like maybe so broad that it's not useful, but I think that that's the idea of, when I say I'm a progressive, I feel like that's the role. Like there's a community and a government and a society that all is not really functioning properly, and that we all have different roles to play in helping it be better.
Well, and that is sort of, and I want to get to you too, Nate. That is sort of why I wanted to ask you that, because I saw in that previous interview you did sort of define it in the sense that, well, I do believe government has a role. And I think, 98, 99% of people, regardless of their politics, would say, well, yeah, I'm not for no government. I mean, some people are, and that's cool. So
Sure,
I don't know how
sure.
much that really sets apart progressivism from conservatism, from liberalism, from even mainstream libertarianism. It does sound like you're saying that there are certain structures that should be changed. I think you'd find a lot of agreement with libertarian types, even some conservative types.
Right.
So that's why I was trying to ask, to try to get a little more specific.
And so sometimes it's sort of like, what are the structures that we have trouble with, right? Or how much of a role should government have? Or, those are sort of the differences, right? So I think that between progressives or conservatives, sometimes it's like, well, nobody likes the way things are going, but like, what are the problems that you actually see? What are the structures and systems in place that are actually harming people? And then between sort of like everyone else and libertarians, it's like how much role or how much power should the government have to address those things, and how should they do it? So I think those are all, fair game in terms of, like specific issues or just general topics.
Okay.
On
Well,
that note,
Nate,
then, yeah, Jason, of the non-financial systems that you see issue with, that progressives take issue with as well too, that Bitcoin can help with, is there one in particular that really stands out in your mind? You could give us a bit of a layout of how Bitcoin can help and why it's also so important for the progressive community.
Yeah, I mean, so the number one thing that jumps out in terms of just an issue that progressives care about before they're ever into Bitcoin is like the idea of environmentalism and global warming and all of, like, global climate change. These are things that just run of the mill progressive people, liberal people are going to latch onto. And I go into my book in great detail about how the ways that Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining specifically could address and mitigate some of those concerns. I think that's sort of, it's connected to the financial system, of course, and there's a lot of sort of misaligned incentives and things like that are causing and contributing to that problem. But it's not, there are also people out there that will deny that this is true or it's happening or that maybe it's not so bad and it's just an excuse for the government to control people. And that's not a language that would probably resonate with anybody in my audience, right? So I feel like that. So I think that's that's just a specific example of saying, all right, well, like, I think that global climate change is real and it's caused by humans, and that here are the ways and the offsets that we can do to help mitigate that. Some of those are worth it, and some of those need to be longer term solutions. But Bitcoin, in terms of incentivizing renewables and mitigating methane and all of these things, and maybe even more so than that, just educating people about how the electrical grid works and how electricity does and doesn't work, and that just using electricity is inherently a bad thing. Those are all really useful conversations to have if you're trying to get somebody on board to Bitcoin who has only heard that it's harmful to the environment or something like that. If there's a low information person who's just starting their journey, it's not useful. And there are plenty. I don't even know where you guys are on this, but well, global climate change is just a hoax so the government can control more people, right? That that's fine if you believe that. That's not going to win over anybody that sort of fits within my target audience.
No,
That makes
100%.
sense.
It was something that Spike Cohen said to us recently too, that really stood out to me, is that people have to first know that you care about them and what's important to them before they're even remotely opening to listening to you. And so you have to come at it. You have to attack the left from the left, the right from the right. You have to come at it from their perspective and first demonstrate empathy before they're really going to be open to particularly a novel or conflicting idea. I do just want to tease out briefly, if you can, even just the elevator pitch or a little bit of an explanation too. We do have a lot of newcomers actually stopping by the channel. For someone that hasn't heard how Bitcoin can improve upon environmental issues, could you give us a little bit more information about that?
Sure. So, the very structure of Bitcoin mining, like as an industry, is important to understand that there's essentially perfect demand response within the Bitcoin mining, operation. So, what that means is if there is a demand for electricity from other sources, let's say there's a heat wave and a lot of people are trimming on their air conditioners, and they need electricity in a community, then a Bitcoin miner who's plugged into that same electrical grid can immediately and with sort of instant accuracy dial down their operations or turn them off. So this demand response is important because if you really care about, let's say, renewable energy sources, things like solar and wind, and in your mind that's sort of the path towards having sustainable energy production, or at least a part of it. Those sources of electricity that are being generated are variable, right? The sun's not shining all the time and the wind's not blowing all the time. So if there's a demand side and Bitcoin miners have to dial down or dial up because of that demand, well, the same is true for the supply of electricity. If when electricity is generated, it needs to be used, or it sort of dissipates into the earth. There's no financially viable way to store massive amount of electricity for like a grid. So all of which is to say that if you want your electrical grid to be, primarily hooked up to wind or solar power, having Bitcoin miners available to you to sort of dial up or dial down their demand is useful, because it can kind of balance the grid. And in addition to that, a lot of renewable sources, things like hydropower and wind and solar, sometimes there's not really an incentive to build that out because the demand doesn't exist where the electricity is being supplied immediately. So Bitcoin miners are, just as a whole, are a revenue source and able to sort of incentivize the build out of that infrastructure, which is costly, and a revenue source for those companies who are trying to generate electricity in a way that, might not be incentivized to do that otherwise. So you're going to see more solar, more wind, more hydropower, things like that. So those are a couple of quick tidbits. There's also wasted methane gas in landfills and in oil fields and things like that. It just gets burned off and released to the atmosphere. And Bitcoin mining, because it's location agnostic and can move anywhere, and it's pretty mobile, can actually utilize that energy and in the process mitigate it and turn it into less harmful greenhouse gases. So there's a lot of different ways that it can happen, but certainly the picture as it's painted in a lot of the media or some politicians is like, well, you're using electricity and that's bad. And it's just more complicated than that. I had a conversation recently with somebody and just sort of articulating the differences between like a Bitcoin mining operation and an AI data center, and how Bitcoin miners are willing and are responsive to turn off when they need to. And that was news to that person, right? They just lumped it all in together and didn't really distinguish. So like that education is part of what I'm trying to do.
Well, Jason, this is the internet. We don't do nuance here. So.
I prefer the long form. At least if somebody cares about it, they can watch the whole thing. Yeah.
Imagine mining Bitcoin cheaper than buying on an exchange, with direct payouts hitting your wallet like clockwork. Saz Mining makes it real. You own the rig, no gimmicks. It's your asset pumping out Bitcoin every single day. No markup on hardware or electricity. They get paid when you get paid, fully aligning incentives. Mining Bitcoin below exchange cost is a great way to DCA your stack. It's so simple, anyone can do it. No tech skills required. You get white glove support and education, a rig performance guarantee, plus it's powered by 100% carbon-free energy prioritizing renewables. Ready to take control of your Bitcoin future? Visit sazmining.com by scanning the QR code or clicking the link in the description down below to book a free consult and start mining today. Attention all freedom-loving Alberta Bitcoiners. Tired of the big six banks freezing funds, blocking transactions, or slamming your account shut without warning or explanation just for dipping into Bitcoin? Remember the Freedom Convoy debanking nightmare?
The federal government has invoked the Emergencies Act.
But don't let them control your money or erase your financial life. Join the pioneers over at Bow Valley Credit Union, a place run by freedom and sound money advocates. I bank there myself. They are the first and only traditional bank or credit union in Canada to directly integrate Bitcoin via their Bitcoin gateway. If you have to use dollars, why settle for a fiat-only account when you could seamlessly move in and out of Bitcoin? No hassle, no questions, no rehypothecation, no leverage. This isn't paper Bitcoin. Withdraw to self-custody at any time. Insured and auditable, it's perfect for adding Bitcoin to your corporate balance sheet. If you or your business is in Alberta, switch to your Bitcoin refuge at bowvalleycu.com. Scan the QR code or click the link below. Continuing with that, Jason, there was something actually that you said earlier that really stood out to me, and I have this idea. Could be a completely crazy idea, but I wanted to run it past you. So you spoke about Bitcoin being attracting people who feel disadvantaged, and that kind of being part of the progressive view. The thing that I was thinking about the other night is kind of the idea of skating to where the puck is, where the puck's going to be, or versus where the puck necessarily currently is. I kind of have this theory that Bitcoin is not necessarily, it's always going to be kind of libertarian, but it's definitely not necessarily conservative. That I think what it is it's anti-authoritarian. And what I mean by that is it's always going to find itself with the underdog of the day, depending on what the dominant culture is, depending on what the dominant political party is, that it'll be the people who feel disadvantaged that need something that gives them that power of the individual that's going to ultimately attract them back. And so with that, I would say that over the last maybe decade or so, the Trump phenomenon and kind of what we've seen rise up there was a response to, I would call kind of pseudo-progressive authoritarianism. You can think of like the cancel culture, a bit of a harder swing in terms of moving, what would you say? Yeah, I'd say the cancel culture, the kind of a little more nanny state aspects coming into. I think we definitely felt like conservatives were being pushed to the outskirts, being kind of marginalized, and then we had this response in return. And I think that's why that group was primed and ready for Bitcoin, right? They felt like they had no power. They need something to kind of boost them up. In that same vein, I'm getting increasingly concerned that we're seeing the pendulum swing back the other way, that we might have, unfortunately, a return to think like the George Bush neocon kind of years, that we might have this conservative kind of authoritarianism creeping into the dominant culture, creeping into that position where then your progressives of the day would feel like the disenfranchised, the disadvantaged ones. And I think that would really prime them to be a new large cohort coming to Bitcoin as they feel that they've lost some power and are trying to protect themselves. That we might actually be looking at kind of an era of progressive Bitcoiners in the coming years, particularly like even, I don't want to talk too much about current culture. It definitely seems like things are getting ramped up and super hot, but I was even seeing conservative commentators calling for capital punishment on things like armed robbery. Right. And that to me just immediately sets off red flags. Like that is going to be a terrible escalation. And I don't want to give the state the power to kill anybody. I'm very hesitant to give the state that sort of authority and power. And so I feel like, again, I'm seeing this rise of like, okay, now that conservatives might be taking over the culture again, they might start trying to impose their will a little bit. And that this would lead to the next group of Bitcoiners being the progressives who feel like they need that defense system. Crazy idea. Just want to throw that kind of out to you and the tag onto it. I think that's why it's so important from a Bitcoin adoption standpoint. Again, no matter like Bitcoin grows stronger by your worst enemy even adopting it, right? The more people in the network, the better for everyone. We move to that global kind of reserve currency status. So I think it's important that Bitcoiners be ready to potentially welcome these people because they might be very open to it if we see some creeping right-wing authoritarianism. A lot of stuff. Thoughts?
Yeah, no, lots of thoughts. I'd say I probably agree with most of that if you take out like kind ofs and the maybes, right? Like,
I was trying to soften my position.
No, I know. I think that most definitely, and if you're inside sort of the conservative libertarian Bitcoin bubble, you might not see this, but this is 100% a concern for people out there, right? Like, we've elected somebody who. The fear is does not respect the peaceful transition of power. We see people, we see the military on American soil. So like the authoritarianism, like the problems and the worries from, the progressive audience certainly is there. Right. And so you have this idea that like I think what you're saying is like Bitcoin is sort of the money for the resistance. It's the money for the people who are in like, have less political power or what have you. So I agree with that. I think that that's one of the messages. I think that, we see already, there's people who need to travel out of state to get healthcare because their state has outlawed certain healthcare procedures. They're being tracked and their finances are being tracked. Like Bitcoin is a tool for people to do something that they think they need to do. And there's a lot of other examples too. So I feel like that money for the resistance, and certainly is true. That's what Bitcoin is. I think that you make a good point. No matter who's adopting Bitcoin, it's one step closer to sort of this adoption and, global reserve currency and hyperbitcoinization. You need the network effect. If you want Bitcoin to kind of achieve what we're hoping it does, you need people to be using it. And there is no doubt that people outside of the sort of the conservative bubble are viewing what's happening. We don't need to get into it as much as you want to get into it, but like they're concerned, right? They're seeing conservatives enforce their will and changing policies and ruling by executive order and all sorts of stuff that like some Bitcoiners like, yay, executive order, but then there's a lot of other things that are really concerning and sort of make people on the left fearful of what's the next step and where are we 3 years from now, those kinds of things. And I think Bitcoin is the money for the resistance, right? Like the rebel cause. So I think that's a perfectly valid way to frame it.
No, beautiful. Yeah, I'm immediately reminded too of just like Occupy Wall Street and kind of when it first began. Like it just seems like we're just going through that transition and we're going to be coming back the other way. And it would be nice because my view is, and again, it's all self-interested. I want libertarians to take over and just leave everybody alone, right? That's where I want to be. But I ultimately think that the pendulum swings will continue to escalate until they ultimately stop. And then Bitcoin is the way to actually stop the pendulum swing, to have these kind of giant moves in culture so that we can actually go to the position of people just living amongst and doing the kind of going to a state or a city that has the values and the opportunities that they want to see and no longer feeling that they have to impose their will on the other side, regardless of what position it is. So yeah, I do think it's really important that the non-progressive Bitcoiners be prepared to get them on our team, get them on Team Bitcoin as they start to see problems with the existing system they may not have noticed before when it was maybe doing things that they agreed with.
Right.
Gary, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I did want to ask you a question, which isn't necessarily specific to the progressive side of Bitcoin, just Bitcoin in general. You mentioned Bitcoin being kind of rebel money, so to speak. And I'm with you on that. And you've seen there are certainly members of the Bitcoin space that are very happy with the idea of government starting a Bitcoin strategic reserve and government buying more, or governments around the world buying more for number go up. And sure, in my Bitcoin wallet, that looks great for me. But on the flip side, I'm like, I thought we did all this to kind of take power away from the state. Where do you fall on that?
Yeah, I think that I'm not philosophically opposed to a Bitcoin, strategic Bitcoin reserve necessarily. I think that if I were to prioritize the things that I would like government to do in response to Bitcoin, that would be sort of at the bottom. I think that, sort of protecting your right to own like a non-hosted wallet or mine Bitcoin or transact in Bitcoin, being able to transact in Bitcoin without being a taxable event. These are way more important, I think, for most Bitcoiners, I would imagine, apart from the number go up. So I feel like it's just sort of I would just categorize it as a misstep. I think that anybody can buy Bitcoin and invest in it and use it as a resource. So I'm not going to say that the government shouldn't do that. But if I were in a position of power and advising people in the government, I would be advocating for those other things first, way before a strategic Bitcoin reserve. I think it has. I think the strategic Bitcoin reserve is sort of a part of the short-term thinking that's happening a little bit with sort of this marriage of politics and Bitcoin that's happening right now and started maybe during the 2024 election. So, it sounds like we're probably in agreement on that. I don't think the strategic Bitcoin reserve is like the number one priority. Obviously, that's what was, at least what it seems like, was pushed as the number one priority, and like the signal that this administration is pro Bitcoin and all of these things. But that raises the question too of like mixing in all of these other cryptocurrencies and sort of what's being done in the education front to differentiate Bitcoin from the rest of this, and it's really gotten muddier rather than more clear, which is also unfortunate.
I mean, Jason, you're talking about being secure in private property, not making Bitcoin spending a taxable event. You're sort of sounding like a libertarian here.
Well, and there's overlap, right? I mean,
there is
certainly the issue that a lot of people have with libertarianism is, I don't want to speak for everybody. I'll speak for myself, right? Like, how do you deal with like the negative externalities as a society? And I feel like you can do whatever you want as long as it doesn't harm somebody else. And the definition of have you harmed somebody else and what does that mean in its most abstract form is really hard to answer.
Fair.
So I feel like
Fair.
there are places where liberals and progressives are going to overlap with libertarianism, and same thing with conservatives. So I feel like you guys have the benefit of saying, hey, you know how you like, legalize marijuana and prostitution, and like you guys like guns. Like you get to do, you get to have that benefit.
Let's do it all.
Of everything, right? Exactly. So there certainly we're going to find plenty of places where we overlap. I think that I should be able to use Bitcoin, and spend it as sort of a medium of exchange without being a taxable event. I don't think that. I don't know how that works necessarily within the current laws as they're written. So that's why I would say I would be advocating for something like that, right? And there's plenty of other places where I don't overlap with libertarians. But hopefully respectfully so.
Of course, yeah.
Well, you're going to find weird overlap in different places. Like I was just talking with Gary before the show. Is like I technically overlap with communists as well too, because if I'm not mistaken, the end state of communism is a stateless, moneyless classless society. Stateless, I am 100% on board with you guys on that. Moneyless, well, we can get rid of fiat and maybe compromise. And then classless is like, yeah, there's not going to be a political or financial elite taking advantage of other people. So you can find commonality with just about anybody these days if you really try to empathize, take your time, and listen to what they have to say. I want want to tease apart a little bit more about kind of what's going on maybe with the Democrats right now, maybe some conversations that you're having. Kind of couple different angles that are sticking out to me. One, that I think that Bitcoin is entering, it will eventually reach the point where like every politician is just pro Bitcoin. It just becomes like, yes, we're going to lower taxes and have Bitcoin. Like that's just kind of going to be the standard talking point at some point.
Right.
I'm wondering if you think that perhaps the Democrat side, what their current view of Bitcoin is and where it may be headed, particularly for the next election coming up, because that'll be interesting with no incumbent.
Mm-hmm.
And then additionally, if you think that progressives accepting Bitcoin, maybe that being wrapped into their policy positions as well too, does it necessitate that do you think it's likely to come from a bottom up sort of standpoint, progressives getting into Bitcoin, politicians pandering, or do you think the politicians may find their own kind of game theoretical incentives for why they want to get on board with it and then leading the audience there as well?
It's a great question. I think I have my preference about how it would be, which is bottom up, right? I wrote my book for the audience of like the voter, not the politician. And the hope there was to educate a broad swath of progressives about the value of Bitcoin and then have them pressure the politicians. That's not how it's going to happen. So this is like an admission of defeat in terms of like my primary hope for the book that I wrote. But that said, I do think that it is happening. And, I don't necessarily like the fact that it's going to happen from politicians realizing there's no viable choice except to get behind Bitcoin. And then educating the populace and the voting population thusly, right? So it's going to be, all right, well, we're in a really competitive swing district. We need to win this House seat. It's not going to happen from like the bluest of blue congressional districts. It's going to happen from those like borderline swing states. So how can I appeal to, more than 50% of the people in this district? And being against Bitcoin in that way is not necessarily going to work for you. I think that the Democrats, as a large organization, understand that Bitcoin was part of, their loss in 2024. If you hear Bitcoiners talk, it's like the only reason they lost. It's not, but it's definitely the Democratic Party writ large, and the people advising them understand that it was part of and an important part, and certainly overlaps with a lot of the reasons that the Democrats lost in 2024. So I think that the politicians are shifting not from a sense of like being pressured by their core voters, but by the populace in general, and realizing that this is something that's popular. I think that there's plenty of people now with the inclusion of the ETFs and the different Bitcoin strategic companies, all of that stuff. It just indicates that, if we go after this and make Bitcoin an enemy, then it's going to be a losing battle. So I feel like I think that's unfortunately going to be the direction, not what I was hoping for, but I guess in the end, it's going to be somewhat of the same result, right? Where you have politicians sort of pandering to the wider audience and then educating progressive voters and saying, yeah, we can't take this other option. We can't fight Bitcoin. We need to be part of it. And so some of the conversations that I'm saying is exactly that. It's the organizations that support the Democratic Party themselves realizing that they need new policies on this. They need to understand, they need education, and reaching out to people like me and others to say, well, how can we learn about this? How can we educate our campaign managers? How can we educate our candidates about this? So when 2026 rolls around and the midterms, or even 2028 and in a presidential year, I think that the general tone from the Democratic Party is going to be way different about Bitcoin. And unfortunately, they're going to lump crypto into it and call it digital assets and all of that, but just like the Republicans have. So I think you're going to see a much different tone, and just coming from a space of political necessity. And then once it gets sort of that vetted, approved, like this is okay for us, shine around it, then the everyday voter will come along and try to learn about it. So I think that's kind of the direction I see it happening.
No, it's very interesting. I think it's unfortunate that there probably was a ton of people out there that went like, oh, Trump likes it now, I'll check out Bitcoin. Despite I know that Walker used this exact example that they had somebody in their life that was giving them some good information. I have some more questions, but Gary, I'll let you jump in there.
Well, yeah, you mentioned politically how, one side seems to have embraced it or whatever. But even using the term sides is silly, because I remember reading somebody saying somewhere, which made a lot of sense to me, that in the United States, at least, there should probably be about 6 different political parties. But because we have a 2-party system, everybody's kind of lumped into one team or the other. And certainly you could make the case that, Thomas Massey is a very different person from Lindsey Graham. And, Ro Khanna is a very different person from Elizabeth Warren. And Ro Khanna embraces Bitcoin. Elizabeth Warren decidedly does not.
Right.
Why do you think, at least recently, because I don't think this was always the case, at least in the initial years of Bitcoin, but why in the last few years has Bitcoin been much more embraced on the political right, to use that crude term, as opposed to the political left?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's just sort of a more natural overlap between the libertarian sort of political influence, at least within the United States, and the conservative political influence. So I think that libertarianism kind of aligns with Bitcoin in this sort of philosophical way, and then conservatives latched onto that, right? So I'm making a distinction between those two camps. And I think that ultimately is really easy. It's a blind spot for a lot of Democrats. And speaking about like elected officials like Elizabeth Warren, I think that your political intuition is this is money that intersects with the internet and therefore it's a scam. That is actually a pretty good algorithm to figure out like that's true, right? So I'm going to protect people from that. I'm going to make these the bad guys. So I feel like there was just sort of a misstep right from the very beginning. That heuristic of saying, well, this is bad, so I should fight it and protect my constituents. And then as things are, I think there's just a matter of our political discourse as it is now, right? We have a media that makes everything seem really important. And if the other side is winning, then we're losing. And that's not just like, oh, unfortunate, but it's super existential. Like the fate of our country and the fate of the world depends on this. So it's just hard to sort of unravel that once you lock in, right? And so I feel like, that's the simplest answer is that a couple of people on the right figured it out. A couple of people on the left like followed their gut and decided it was a bad thing. And of course, it's more complicated than that. I think I'll also say that in the last couple of years with Trump's, I made this point to a friend recently, say, like, if I walked into Mar-a-Lago and said, hey, Trump, you should support Bitcoin and change your stance, because we know that he was against Bitcoin previously, and he agreed to it so quickly that you should probably be suspicious. Like if somebody is willing to just change their mind so quickly and be all in favor and tweet out what you want to tweet out and go to the conference and say all these things, then maybe you should have like just a little bit of suspicion, especially if you're sort of overarching like Bitcoin narrative is not to trust politicians. So I feel like there was an opportunistic gamble made by some people in the Bitcoin community and people in the Trump organization that was like sort of a perfect marriage. And I feel like I mean that opportunistic in just a literal sense, right? Like they're just going to say, okay, this is what we can do to get more votes, and this is what we can do to get more clout. And so both sides really latched onto it. And, I've argued many times that I think that's just short-term thinking. It's not really good for Bitcoin adoption in the long run. It's not really what we want, but it just was too tempting to not go after, I guess, for some people, unfortunately.
If I may, real quick, Nathan, I just have one more question. What do you find is sort of like the reflexive, most common pushback, one or two things that you get from fellow progressives when you suggest Bitcoin?
Now it's Trump, right? Like it's 100%. They have like I was saying, like, what's your heuristic to decide if something is good or bad? Like if you decide that like something that Trump likes is bad or a scam, then you're going to be right 99% of the time. So if Trump is into Bitcoin, and you already kind of thought before Trump even started with Bitcoin, oh, that seems a little scammy. Like there's internet, it's not from the government, it's the money. Like if that's already your mindset, and now Donald Trump is involved in it, and we know he's also involved in all these other crypto self-dealing and grifting and things like that. That's a really powerful like model to have to overcome from my position, right? So I feel like number one, it's Donald Trump. Now before that, it's it's essentially just a misunderstanding. It's low information. It's like not understanding that money doesn't have to come from the government, or that it doesn't have to be, physically in your hand. Just like really basic stuff like that, or that it's bad for the environment, or that it just makes certain people really rich, and they don't deserve to be really rich. So those are the most common things overall. But right now, there's no question. It's every single time I thought that Donald Trump liked something and it turned out to be a really bad thing, I was right. And now Bitcoin is the most recent thing, right? So now if you like Donald Trump, then you don't have that heuristic, you don't have that decision making. But there's 55% of the country right now is not liking the way Donald Trump is doing things. So that's pretty common pushback I get.
Yeah. Thanks, Nate.
Are you sick of the fiat-funded fast fashion that falls apart quicker than the dollar? The cheap stuff made to drain your wallet one inferior product at a time? Stop it. There's a better way. Panties for Bitcoin is a family-oriented company built by Bitcoiners for Bitcoiners and held to that unbreakable Bitcoin standard. Certified made in Italy underwear that lasts as long as your metal backups. Guys, grab a couple pairs of those lightning boxers for yourself, the softest, most comfortable, durable pair you'll ever own. And surprise your lady with luxurious panties, bras, and thongs. No better way to spark those all-too-important Bitcoin conversations and spread adoption than attractive people in their underwear. Naturally, you can pay with Bitcoin, supporting the circular economy and building that parallel system. Simply scan the QR code or click the link in the description down below and head to pantiesforbitcoin.com and use promo code BTC Sessions to save 10%. Snag yours and share your love for Bitcoin in a new peer-to-peer way. I want to ask kind of almost from like a strategic standpoint, we can dive into it a bit more too as well. One, I would think that from the Democrat political party, that getting potentially a new donor class, particularly like West Coast kind of progressives that might be into Bitcoin, that might be very beneficial from even just a fundraising standpoint. But I want to ask, in your opinion, is even necessary in the conversations, do progressives coming to the conversation have to understand the problem with the money first before they're going to be open to it? And going back to kind of the earlier point about the pendulum swinging being the underclass, I would imagine that even still currently progressives have more faith and trust in institutions, which would include like the Federal Reserve and kind of the monetary system overall, whereas conservatives, and for sure libertarians, would not, maybe priming them up. So succinctly put, do we have to educate progressives about the Fed first in order to get them into Bitcoin? Is it a requirement? And if you have had those kind of conversations, are they open to the problems with the Federal Reserve system, and what kind of maybe gets their attention or works?
Yeah, I think the short answer is no. And again, just sort of from a teaching education standpoint, right? Like we talk, I teach high school mathematics, so I'm teaching calculus. And it's all about keeping people in what they call a proximal zone of development. You want them to be uncomfortable, but not too uncomfortable. That way you can grow and learn and you're pushing yourself, but you don't feel like overwhelmed or lost, or, it's too far. So if you start a conversation with somebody on the political left, like we have to get rid of the Federal Reserve, if that's your opening line, or if that's sort of your main argument, you've lost them. Okay. And maybe a lot of people listening to this, I think, don't even realize that.
Yeah.
So obviously I've been into Bitcoin for N years. I've done all of the research. I've read all the books. I know, the creature from Jekyll Island. Obviously, we have to get rid of the Fed. You start that conversation, you're not within somebody's proximal zone of development. It's too far from where they are. Now, if you're willing to talk to them, not about how the money is broken necessarily, but to find things that they see that are wrong with society. And they might not attribute that to the money being broken, but you're able to kind of describe to them the problem and echo back to them what their concerns are and how Bitcoin kind of addresses that issue or helps mitigate the problem. That's much more likely to resonate. So I feel like if you want to talk about, wealth inequality as a problem that a lot of progressives see within our society, and is a genuine concern in terms of just the stability of society and having massive wealth inequality being a problem, you can kind of slowly work into the idea that there's maybe even without saying Federal Reserve, but the way the money is created and the Cantillon effect and all of these things are contributing to that problem that you already see. I'm not trying to convince you that there's a problem and then have you agree with it. If you start by saying, oh, we got to get rid of the Fed, let me tell you why the Fed is a problem, then you're not going to probably win them over, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I feel like the real strategy is, you mentioned a whole new class of political donors. I think that some of the people I talk to that are high up in the Democratic Party or advisors to the Democratic Party or think tanks that sort of supply talking points to the Democratic Party are absolutely like, how can we get the money? How can we say the right things so that people donate? I think that's part of it. I think the much more sort of naive view for me is like, how do we make the world a better place, right? So you talk about
That's why we're here.
right?
So we're here, man.
Right. And it could get discouraging. I think it's true for any political party. It's not about Democrats necessarily, but I think you start talking about the pro-social use cases of Bitcoin. Here are the problems that you see in the world, and here's how Bitcoin can help. And if you think that Donald Trump is going to freeze your bank account because you donated to Black Lives Matter and like that's now a terrorist organization and he's going to crack down, a lot of people are thinking things like that. And you're not trying to learn about Bitcoin, then I don't know what to do, right? So I feel like you figure out what are the pinch points, what are the problems that people are saying, and you just speak their language in a way that, and again, you might be saying something, you might be saying the exact same sentence that somebody else might be like, oh, he's talking about destroying the Federal Reserve without ever saying it, right? And so I feel like that's probably the way you got to go about doing it. You give them enough to understand that you get their problems and you're proposing a solution without giving them everything. So it'd be too overwhelming or they would just knee jerk fight against it.
Two things quick, and then Gary, I'll let you jump in. One, I'm curious because I'm sure you would have talked about like the Human Rights Foundation in some of your conversations too. I'm wondering if you find that actually is effective and resonating. The concern I always have with using those examples is that if it's too far removed, like those people over there, even though they might empathize, it doesn't land in a visceral way, like a threat to yourself, like your account being shut down. So I'm just curious how those kind of conversations go. And then additionally, if you were advising these Democratic strategists on the best way to communicate to both kind of like to put out a Bitcoin message and maybe to communicate to Bitcoiners, what areas do you think that they should lean into? Is it targeting specific influencers, maybe in the progressive space and trying to educate them about Bitcoin? Or is there certain things do you think like, guys, if you roll with this, I think it'll work?
Yeah. So I'll answer the first question or the second question first, which is I think that at a very basic level, the Democrats are just starting out, right? They have shown interest. They've shown a desire. They've shown they understand the need to get into Bitcoin, and it's literally just like how can I get a talking point that's actually correct? Like how do I use a vocabulary about Bitcoin or something like that? And so like it would be amazing if we can get a few like very high profile Bitcoin progressive influencers to actually like just even consider Bitcoin in a serious way, not as a joke. I think we're going to get there eventually, but it just seems like we're going uphill. I think the messaging for me has always been, we want to see, policies and laws put into place that lets everyday Americans benefit from the use of Bitcoin, not just the Trump family, right? I think that you drive home the point that there's really good, useful, important ways to use Bitcoin and understand it, and that Donald Trump, who you all hate, is not doing those things, right? So you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and say because he likes Bitcoin, now you're allowed to hate it. It's what are the positive pro-social use cases of Bitcoin? What are the good things that people can do for everyday working people? And then just contrast that if you feel like you need to contrast that with what Donald Trump is doing, which is not necessarily aligned with the ethos of Bitcoin, at least certainly not 100%. So I feel like that's the messaging that takes place. And I forgot your first question.
Oh, if like the stories of the Human Rights Foundation, if you find those actually impactful, or if they're too far removed from like an American audience, more or less.
No, I think that, if I'm perfectly honest, I think that those are impactful and resonate. I think, offering up Alex Gladstein's Check Your Financial Privilege is a really good starting point. I think that that will resonate with some people, not all. I think that there's a lot of people on the left who, even if they don't truly deeply believe in like these human rights causes across the globe, feel like they at least need to play lip service to it. So it's a really cynical view, but I feel like that's true, right?
Yep.
And that's not unique to Democrats or liberals. That's true for everybody. So I feel like if you could at least in some cases, not all cases, guilt them into saying, well, listen, your money works. You're an American. Like your debit card is working. It's not being shut down or confiscated. Then, but these other people don't have that privilege. That really speaks their language too. But it's also increasingly true that there's people on the left within the United States who are fearing that we're slipping into authoritarian rule, and like we're under threat, and whether or not where we are on that path could be up to debate. But I think that there's a mirror argument to be made to say, okay, well, there's dictators all over the world that are freezing bank accounts, confiscating funds, taking away funding for their political opposition, and controlling the populace with the financial system. And do you think that we're immune from that here? And I think that would resonate with a lot of people right about now.
Yeah, no, 100%. Gary?
From a strategic standpoint, we acknowledge right now that the political right, as kind of crude as that term is, sort of has, the Bitcoin crowd right now on their side. Do you believe that there is any issue that the left could take advantage of to kind of outflank the right? Now, I would suggest, you mentioned earlier, not having Bitcoin transfers and spending be taxable events, but then we're talking like eliminating the capital gains tax, and that doesn't strike me as something the left would be on board with. But is there something that you would see? And if you haven't given it any thought, that's fine. Where the left say, "Aha, the right has missed this. We'll get the Bitcoin crowd with this."
Yeah, I think I do think there's an answer to that question. I just think it's very unlikely that they'd be able to do it. So I feel like the right answer to that is to be the political party that's Bitcoin only, and to realize that we don't need all of these other like cryptocurrencies and digital assets and all of those things, right? So I feel like that's the way you win over the Bitcoin crowd. They're not able to do that, just from a practical political standpoint, right? You're talking about money. There's not a ton of money flowing into like any political organization from Bitcoin. It's like crypto, right? And so I feel like that's the way you could really win over like the Bitcoin voters. Say, hey, we understand the value of Bitcoin. We're not going to like necessarily stop crypto from happening, but we're not going to like value it in the same way that these Republicans are. Right? You highlight that difference. So I feel like that's what you should do, and that's what I've been advocating for. And of course, people will chuckle at me or dismiss me and so once you get involved with like the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, you have to kind of speak the language that they're willing to speak, and that's like digital assets. It's not Bitcoin. And every time that I say like the word digital assets, like a part of my soul dies a little bit. But that's essentially it's either that or you just don't have the conversation, right? So which one's better? That's where we are right now. So I feel like that's how you do it. I think that from a more practical, like what's possible standpoint is that you highlight the grift and the self-dealing and the scams of the crypto and the Trump and all of this stuff mixed up. And if your political motive is to like get people who are upset at Trump to vote for you, then you just distinguish, say, hey, Bitcoin isn't like that. Trump is doing it wrong. And then you have that conversation, I think, a little bit easier. But you're not going to do it in a way that says, hey, we're like XRP is a scam and we're just going to focus on Bitcoin. That's just not going to be able to do it. So I feel like that's the messaging in terms of strategy. And ultimately, I don't think that, just to be clear, like I don't think that Bitcoin should be only one side or the other. I don't think that we should outflank and like get all of the Bitcoin support. I just think it should just be a non-thing, right? I just think that it should be like you were saying before, we're going to lower taxes and Bitcoin's good, right? Like they're just going to be sort of the standard routine for all politicians. I think that's the goal. It's just really hard to imagine how we get there based on sort of the polarization that we currently have.
No, I want to see everybody fighting for my love. I want all the politicians fighting for my attention and love. This is wonderful. I did just want to quickly add to that because the idea popped into my mind. I don't know if it would fit with a progressive worldview too, but I wonder if there's even opportunity in something like the Samurai Devs case to be the ones to go hard on basically code as freedom of speech and not going after developers. If that sort of, or privacy tools, I'm not sure if privacy tools align with the progressive worldview in such a way that they could try and take that position to get in front and kind of hold up a mirror to Trump for what he did to, Tornado Cash and Samurai Devs.
I think that the privacy vantage point, or like the code of speech vantage point, is really poignant if you're the group that's not in power.
Yep.
And so I feel like that speaks to your previous point. I don't think Democrats as a political organization are like, yeah, code of speech, privacy, when they're the ones in power, right? So I feel like right now, the Democrats are definitely on the ropes. They're licking their wounds. They're figuring out what went wrong, and then you say, yeah, well, we need privacy because if who knows if we want to sort of put up a good resistance towards what Trump is trying to do or what the Republicans are trying to do, we need to be able to transact and communicate and have that privacy. I think that's more like, yeah, Democrats will be on board because they're not the ones in power right now. So that might resonate too.
Very cool. Very cool. Gary?
Do you believe that it's merely just a matter of time before fellow progressives kind of get on board with Bitcoin, or do you believe that affirmative action, not in the way we think do you believe that affirmative steps have to be taken by fellow progressives to try to teach them and convince them?
I think the answer to that depends on your timeline, right? Like, I think eventually everybody, like, it's not going to be Bitcoiners; it's just be called people, right? Eventually,
Yes.
And so I feel like I truly believe that. But like, if we're trying to talk about like within my lifetime, what kind of progress are we going to see? I think that affirmative steps do need to be taken to educate. Now, like we said before, that looks like it's going to probably be coming from sort of the political class and saying like, oh, it's not that bad. Like, it's actually, this is what's good about it, as opposed to the bottom up, which is what I would have preferred. But I do think that that's going to happen, and it's going to happen if we're going to see sort of like substantial movement from the people on the left side of the political spectrum about Bitcoin, like in the next 10, 15, 20 years, right? So I don't think that, my goal in writing the book was to write a book like a progressive case for Bitcoin. Like, you're you're a progressive person, you're kind of curious about Bitcoin, you keep hearing about it, you want to learn about it. Like, now there's a resource that will speak your language. That was written for like the class of 2025, right? Like, aspirationally, like as we kind of think about the 4-year cycles and how adoption grows, that was my hope. So I feel like it's possible that we have a lot of advocacy, happening with, not just my book, but there's other progressive people in the Bitcoin space. The Progressive Bitcoiner is a nonprofit organization that started this year, who's just providing like educational resources to voters, constituents, politicians. It's a nonprofit organization that's actually trying to do that proactive reach out, educating. Here's a resource. It seems like you're curious. Watch this video. Here's a book. That kind of thing. So, hopefully that just sort of continues to gain traction as I think it is. I think that it's really hard for people to dismiss Bitcoin as like a silly idea now compared to 5-10 years ago. So as we continue to go and like people just don't feel it's like a punchline, they're going to be curious and they want to learn. They're just making sure that the resources to actually learn in a language that speaks to those people exist and are ready for them.
I'm kind of curious. Sorry, Gary, just jumping quick.
Go ahead.
For the Progressive Bitcoiners nonprofit, what kind of resources are they offering up? Is it like education, workshops? I'm kind of curious how they're, especially doing Bitcoin education myself, how they're getting into the weeds and doing it, and how they're would you say targeting their audience. And then I also want to ask too, speaking going back to the Progressives case for Bitcoin, do you have any updates coming out to the book, or maybe a second one maybe in the works, or how is that? Or is it kind of finished product for now?
So the Progressive Bitcoiner is, like I said, they were just incorporated as a nonprofit this year in 2025. And, they're in the process of trying to get funding, and people can donate if they want. They can find the website.
Can they donate in sats?
Yes, they can. Absolutely. Or full Bitcoin if you want.
That's so magnanimous of you.
Right. I mean, I just want people to have options. So they're out there providing articles that speak to specific pro-social use cases, things that align with progressive values for Bitcoin. They're providing videos. They're providing, they had for a long time, even before it was incorporated as a nonprofit, a podcast where you have long-form conversations. They're speaking to not in a way that's compliant with nonprofit regulations. They're speaking to interested political constituents and consultants and things like that to educate people about Bitcoin too. So there's a lot of different resources out there available. One pagers. Here's what you need to know about Bitcoin from an environmental standpoint or from an authoritarian standpoint. So they're doing all of that good work and more. I think that they're limited by sort of funding right now. I think that everyone who works for or is like part of the board, I'm part of the board, has a day job, right? So there's no like full-time employee of the Progressive Bitcoiner yet. Maybe that will be an aspiration so we can keep putting out that content. As for the book, The Progressive Case for Bitcoin, this fall is going to be, we're going to release a second updated edition. So there's going to be updates to the text in terms of statistics and use cases and just the most current up-to-date things so that politicians and voters have access to what's accurate and current, as well as sort of a whole treatment of the political landscape as it currently lives, right? So I think that for a lot of progressive people who we were mentioning are turned off by the fact that Trump is into Bitcoin, it's a really important to have an explanation about why Trump doesn't speak for Bitcoin and here are the progressive values that Bitcoin aligns with, independent of which politician is supporting it. So you should expect next month a new edition of that book out. And so I'm really excited about that. Bitcoin Magazine has been great to work with in terms of that. I think that it's been an interesting collaboration, just getting an educational resource out there for people. And they were excited for me to write and then release a new edition of that book.
That's wonderful. Gary?
I mean, I would love to take more of your time, but that seems like a nice place to finish with your book promotion.
Yeah. Buy the book.
Yeah. Where can people find you on social media?
So I'm on Twitter, see Jason Maier. The website for my book is bitcoinprogressive.com. And my DMs are open. There's a way to contact me through my website for anybody who has questions or anything like that. So yeah, happy to always engage with people who are reaching out in good faith and want to learn more about either Bitcoin or how to talk to progressive people about Bitcoin. Always welcome to that conversation.
Hey, you. Yes, you watching the Bitcoin price movements and the latest exciting news. It's awesome to stay informed, but the real power of Bitcoin comes from taking control. Don't just watch, take action. Head over to btcsessions.ca/learn for free step-by-step tutorials that guide you through every major skill you need to know, plus full video playlists for deeper dives on any topic you like. And if you're ready for the ultimate fast track, scroll to the bottom and check out bitcoinmentor.io for premium one-on-one experience with my team of Bitcoin experts to ensure you get it right the first time. Don't wait. Secure your Bitcoin future today. Hit the link in the show notes or scan the QR code on the screen.
If you enjoyed this episode with Jason, please do like and subscribe, and check out the previous episode with Walker from the Bitcoin Podcast on starting a Bitcoin podcast.